Welcome to BusinessLine's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello all. Welcome to this episode of BusinessLine State of the Economy podcast. We are fresh out of the G20 Summit. Many in India watched in awe as G20 leaders gathered in Delhi last week managed to reach a consensus on a joint communique. This happened after Indian negotiators convinced the Western nations and the Russia-China duo on a compromised language on the Ukraine conflict. The success of the joint communique was hailed by many as India's diplomatic win. It was seen as the West's acceptance of the fact that issues of importance to the global South could not be overshadowed by the concerns over the war. But could the communique in itself be hailed as a victory for the global South? Did it have enough provisions in areas such as climate change, climate finance, development finance, debt restructuring, and reforms of multilateral development banks to be of benefit to developing countries? Does it give a clear policy direction for the future to ensure that the concerns on the global South remain center stage? I have with me Dr. Biswajit Dhar, Distinguished Professor, Council for Social Development, to analyze the communique for us. Welcome, Dr. Dhar.
Thank you.
Dr. Dhar, to begin with, just tell us how significant was the fact that we had a communique, that a consensus was reached on the language for Ukraine.
No, I think this was a real achievement because the way several of the ministerial meetings went, especially the meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors, which didn't end with a kind of a declaration, but just ended with a chair's statement. There was apprehension that there would not be any declaration at the end of the New Delhi summit. And that would have been a real problem because coming at a time when there are huge global issues that are staring in our face, especially faced by the southern countries, lack of declaration would have meant that, this entire formation was not able to hold together. And again, I would say the added, problem of getting a declaration at the end of the New Delhi summit was that India had brought in onto the table the 55-member African Union. So all this would have actually been sent to the back burner if the declaration had not come. So I see this as a major achievement of Indian diplomacy, and fact that we were able to get the two opposing parties together and get a language that eventually clinched in a New Delhi declaration, and that is for the record.
Right. So what you're saying is that the communique was the first step. Like if we did not have a communique, we wouldn't have any other parts also. But if we, really...
Let me clarify, Amiti, what I was saying, that, look, if we didn't have a communique, then, this would have cast, sort of some certain amount of doubts or considerable doubts on the future of the G20 as a grouping going forward.
Right.
That the G20 can't hold together because they can't actually get their act together. So from that point of view, from the future of the G20, and again from the fact that we are at this critical juncture, this was very significant.
Right. So now if we try and break up the communique, so how significant was it in terms of, what it did for the global South? So for instance, if we look at debt restructuring, it was one of the, primary areas where, India wanted to focus. But, there doesn't seem to be much on debt restructuring, for vulnerable economies like Sri Lanka, is there? Like if you look at the communique, I did not find anything very significant there.
No, that's the disappointing part, that having got a declaration, the contents of this declaration doesn't say anything significant for the global South. Again, the global South, this tagline, this sort of term, became an important political statement that the Indian presidency has been making, the Prime Minister had been making right since the beginning. The first statement that he issued on 1st December when India took over the G20 presidency, he mentioned about the concerns of the global South. And this was something, very interesting because we are hearing this from the government after a long time. I think there still is a confusion in the government as to where we are going to be pitching ourselves. Are we an emerged economy? Are we part of the global South, the developing world? So this sort of confusion seemed to have been sort of settled once the Prime Minister made regular references to the global South. And having said that, I would say that this political message has not been translated into real economic gains for the South. You talked about the debt restructuring. Now, the debt restructuring is an extremely important issue, especially after you got on board the 55 African Union members. Now, the debt restructuring is being talked about from point of view of the low-income countries. There are 70 low-income countries, they're beneficiary countries, of which 40 are members of the African Union. So this is something, delivery on the debt restructuring would have been something huge for the African countries. And this on two counts. One is, of course, the debt overhang prevents these countries from investing in development. So, if you're looking at the SDGs and what have you, the larger canvas of development, they're being hamstrung because they don't have finance. And therefore, concessional finance, reaching them concession finance or finance in general was a very important task. The second is that they need to invest to reach net zero goals. So the investing in adaptation mitigation is something that they need finance. And unless debt burden is lowered, they're not going to be viable, especially when you're looking at the capital markets. Now, on these two grounds, the G20, this framework they adopted 3 years back, the common framework of for ameliorating the debt burden of the developing countries, low-income countries, I would say, that is really inadequate because primarily, I'm not going to go into the details. Primarily, it does not look at the debt overhang and what to do with the debt overhang that these countries owe to the private creditors and multilateral development banks. Now, these are out. So only official creditors are on board. And the official creditors, even for countries, the middle-income countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, they are anywhere between 20 and 30%. The larger share of debt they owe is to private creditors. So without the private creditors on board, we can't go anywhere, and that has not happened. Now, on the question of extending this beneficiaries to the middle-income countries, so that Sri Lanka and Pakistan are also included, the only gain I would say is that Sri Lanka's case has been accepted, and we're working out a debt reduction strategy, not in terms of a haircut to the creditors, but only in terms of rescheduling the debt. So this is only about debt repayment, suspension of debt service. That's all that is happening, nothing more than that. So that is very unfortunate that we didn't go any further than that. The second issue was the restructuring of the multilateral development banks. Now, these are two linked issues because if the multilateral development banks are not adequately capitalized, the questions about their capital adequacy do not cease, and they're actually coming up thick and fast, then the ability of these banks to provide concessional finance is going to be limited. Now, on this issue again, we haven't actually gone very far. This is because the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Yellen said that first we need to look at the reform of these banks and then talk about providing additional finance to them. Now, reform of these banks is again a major political issue because the developing countries and India and China have been making this point for at least a couple of decades now, that the management of the bank and the fund especially should reflect the economic realities of the present times, which is that the voting share should move away from the US and the other developed countries towards the emerging economies. Now that's hanging fire. The only marginal changes that have happened thus far. And the G20 has not really taken any step towards reforming these multilateral development banks.
But the resolution does talk about, collectively mobilizing more headroom and concessional finance to boost World Bank's capacity to support low and middle income countries which need help in addressing global challenges. So you say that you think that does not go too far without these additional things?
No, they don't, because you're not walking the talk. There is a lot of talk about this happening. Providing the additional headroom. Like I mentioned, that looking at the capital adequacy issues, So all these have been mere talk, and this has been going on from at least 2016. So 7 years of talk, but little walk towards addressing this issue.
Right, right. So let us just talk a bit about the major announcements that were made at the G20 summit. So one big announcement was on this global biofuel alliance. So basically, it was seen as one of the key outcomes of the summit. So how do you see this panning out, and to what extent do you think it can forward the global green agenda and also be beneficial to developing countries?
No, this is surely an important step forward. There's no doubt about it. But I think I'm really concerned that whether the biofuel alliance, this kind of shifting of the mix towards biofuels is going to do anything to several countries' food security, for instance. Now, we have a national biofuel strategy which says that the surpluses of the Food Corporation of India can be used for biofuels. Now, this whole surpluses issue is really contentious because many of us feel that the food stocks lying with the FCI are not distributed properly. The public distribution system doesn't work as efficiently as they should. And then we see these numbers of India having a very large number of undernourished people. And the FAO has been telling us year after year that uh, at least three-fourths of the people in this country do not get nourished food. So there has to be a very carefully planned strategy because as if you look at fuel prices, moving food towards fuel is a very attractive proposition for all concerned. Because providing food at low prices is not a very attractive kind of a thing. And then if suppose governments, whoever giving subsidies for food security, they feel that there is no point giving food subsidy. Rather, you just produce food and move it into the fuel stream. That will be pretty problematic. So overall, it's an important decision, no doubt, reducing the emission of greenhouse gases. There are serious underlying concerns that I just spoke about.
Right. So the food versus fuel thing has to be handled very carefully at the policy level.
Absolutely, that is a very strategic decision that countries, individual governments will have to take.
Right. So the G20 Delhi Summit declaration also talks about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So how significant is this resolution? Do you think it is a mere reiteration of past resolutions, or could it serve as an essential reminder, on the task that is ahead of us that the world has been talking about for some time?
Yeah, I think again, this is a reminder to all concerned that fossil fuel subsidies will only encourage more use of these greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think that it is more than more than that kind of a reminder, because the effective thing has to be done on other fronts. So the effective thing has to be, like, for instance, the biofuel alliance will help in reducing the dependence on fossil fuels. Then going into renewable energies, especially solar, again will do the same thing. So I would say that while we keep reiterating this point about fossil fuel subsidies, the important aspect is moving away from dependence on fossil fuels into clean energy sources. That will be the main task before us.
So do you think there was more scope to have more ambitious resolutions on climate change, in this communique?
Surely, I think that one would think that any climate strategy cannot be addressed without effectively addressing the questions of climate finance and providing access to technologies for access to green technologies, I would say. Now, again, this declaration, like many others in the past, have not been very clear, because we are only talking about indirect terms. For instance, like concessional finance for these countries, low-income countries, or providing more, overall financing for climate change. So we are still talking about generalities. So while we are talking about 2030 targets, but we are still talking about generalities. There isn't much seriousness that we see on the part of those countries who are able to provide finance, that is the advanced countries. And I think there is a reason for this because most of these countries are investing heavily in their economies. The US, for instance, has I think, in my view, has overcommitted in terms of restructuring or putting in place its manufacturing sector. So trillions of dollars are going into that. So their headroom is now limited. But the other issue on technology is just a mention of technology, and I'm happy that technology was also mentioned there. So access to technology is a key element. Green technology is a key element in achieving the climate goals, and I don't think we have done enough on that.
Right. Dr. Dhar, another big announcement at the G20 was on the launch of the historic India, Middle East, Europe mega economic corridor. So we have the EU President Ursula von der Leyen saying that it would make trade between India and EU 40% faster. So how do you see this actually happening? Like, it seems that the whole plan seems very ambitious. You have rail links, you have ports. So how do you see this happening, and how soon do you think there could be gains that could be reaped out of this?
Yeah, this is important, no doubt. But when I was reading about this decision, I was concerned about the enormous investment that we had made through our Look East and Act East policy, the connectivity, sort of plans that we had made on the eastern flank of our country and connecting better with our eastern neighbors. Now, this has been going on for a very long time, and I think there are real benefits to be had from this because, there are countries with whom we have already clinched free trade agreements. We haven't done enough in terms of getting market access. Connectivity surely is a big issue in this regard. And I would think that, if we had actually addressed the connectivity issues properly, then there were more gains to be had on the eastern flank. So when we have made a commitment on the western flank as well, the connectivity is on the western flank. So my concern is that you're not going to be able to garner resources to do both the things at the same time. Now, what would be the way forward for the government? How do we actually balance these two absolutely pressing needs? You can't give up. In my view, you can't give up. Decades of investment in terms of policies and others that we have done on the eastern flank, the Look East and the Act East policy. So this kind of the balancing act, how it is to be done, is going to be a major challenge for the government.
Right. Finally, would you rate the admission of the African Union as a permanent member of the G20 as, one of the significant achievements during the summit? And do you think that this could change the balance in the bloc in favor of the developing world?
No, undoubtedly a very important step. I think this is the first expansion of the G20 after it was upgraded to the summit level, and very important countries have been brought in because they were hugely underrepresented in G20. Now the issue again for me is in terms of substance, because now with these many countries from the south represented on the G20. One is again tempted to ask the same old question: what did they get by sitting on the high table? And we haven't seen the South getting anything from sitting on the high table, because in my view, the G20 is basically an extension of the G7. It has actually carried the G7 agenda, and I've been calling this G20 as what has happened to G20 is G7ization of this grouping. Now, there, I think if the dynamics have to change, then India will have to play a very important role, because India has historically played the role of the leader of the South. And these countries in Africa, Latin America, have always looked up to India, and some of these countries in Asia as well, have always looked up to India to provide the political and the intellectual sort of stimulus to think in terms of or rather imagine what South can do and what South can actually achieve. So I think by bringing these countries onto the table, I think India has also taken on a big responsibility on itself. to properly respond or to properly represent the interest of the South in the G20, because only then can the real change take place. Otherwise, this will be another kind of photo op, and nothing more than that.
Right. Dr. Thar, I thank you really wholeheartedly for patiently answering so many questions and helping us understand the nuances of what actually happened at the G20. Well, as we move towards the virtual G20 summit that the PM has proposed in November end to basically, take a stock of how things are being implemented, we hope to have you again with us to discuss a new communique. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.